My girlfriend Evelyn and I have been dating about 4 weeks. 4 incredible weeks. I've never met anyone like her. It's like when she comes into the room, everyone just stops what they're doing and stares. Beautiful isn't a strong enough word. It's more than that. It's almost mesmerizing. A few days ago, she convinced me to go to an old cabin that had been in her family for years. I said yes. I'd never been able to say no to Evelyn. I never wanted to say no. The weekend started out normal. We drove deep in the forest. She insisted that she drive as she knew the way, and I spent my time listening to the music she played. I can't really remember the drive. We arrived at the cabin sometime around dusk, I think, and that's when things started to get a little strange. Evelyn smiled as she picked up an old axe and said she was going to chop wood for a fire. There was something about the way she held the axe. Alone now in the cabin, I searched for a candle while the last moments of sunlight were fading from the forest. I lit a match, held it to the candle, and jumped back in surprise. On the wall was a painting of an old woman, far off in the distance of a field, smiling, I think, in my direction. It looked so old. Yet I swear to God she looked like she was alive. I swallowed and continued down the hallway. Something about this place didn't seem right. It was strange. The cabin looked so small from the outside, but now that I was here, there were endless rooms. How was this even possible? As I walked down the hallway, a single candle illuminating my way, there were dozens of the same painting of that old woman. But they weren't exactly the same. As I continued down the hallway, each new painting showed her a little closer than the last. Beginning to be afraid, I looked backwards towards where I had come from. All I could see was a tunnel of darkness. I tried to open the door to the closest room, thinking maybe I could leave through a window, but every single door was locked. As I kept looking for an escape, I couldn't help but keep glancing at the paintings. The old woman would appear larger, closer. That's when it struck me. There was a cabin in the painting. It looked kinda like this cabin, and she was getting closer to it. This can't be happening, I said. But it was. As the painting now revealed, she was standing on the porch, smiling wide at me and holding the axe that Evelyn had taken. Come to think of it, she was wearing the same clothes that Evelyn had been wearing. And that smile, it was mesmerizing. As I walked down the hallway, I struggled to take my eyes from the smile of the woman in the painting, each new glimpse revealing her a little closer. First, she was opening the doorway to the cabin, then stepping in, and now she stood in front of the hallway. I'm going to die here. I want to run, but I can't take my eyes away from her smile. I realized I knew what she was then. I think I always knew. Staring into the painting one last time, it showed that she was now right behind me. I looked farther into the painting and watched her as she raised the axe. My God, she's so beautiful. I was a child when I first got my dog, Paws. My father was away on a business trip. He went on a lot of those, and somehow I convinced my mother to get a dog. We went together to the pound, and there he was. This pathetic-looking thing huddled in the corner by the concrete walls. He reminded me of myself. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I kind of felt like he looked. Weak. Sad. Well, he waddled over to me, licked my face, and that was that. He was my best friend. Well, nothing happened for about a year as Paws grew up. He turned into a rather strong-looking dog, a big change from him being this pathetic thing slumped over in the corner. A year after I brought him home from the pound, I heard a knock on the door. Walking over, I saw an old, harmless-looking man with gray hair smiling through the glass. I smiled back, opened the door, and before I could even say hello, Paws leapt onto him and bit deep into his face. I tried to get him off, but he just kept tearing away at the old man's flesh. We lived in the city, and a police officer happened to be patrolling nearby and hear the commotion. He took out his gun to shoot Paws, but I screamed and leapt in front of him, shielding him from the officer. The policeman yelled at me to get out of the way, but I loved that dog. The officer kicked Paws off the old man, and my dog cried out in pain. Then, something strange happened. As the officer knelt down to help the old man up, we saw something on the ground next to him. A human ear. The policeman and I just stared at the ear. Then we both looked at the same time back up at the old man. Had Paws torn his ear off? But no. The old man, though bloodied, sure enough had 2 ears. The officer and I stared at each other, both a little confused, and that's when the old man took off, running down the driveway. I watched as the police officer paused for a few moments, then put 2 and 2 together. Something wasn't right here. He chased down the old man and pinned him up against the wall, cuffing his hands and calling for backup. It wasn't until a week later on the news I found out that that old man had been collecting the body parts of little boys. He was indeed a monster. There were 2 other occasions as well, one when I was a little older. I would walk Paws in a park near our home. The funny thing was this park was packed with people, so you'd think it would be safe. Well, every time I would take him, there was a beautiful older woman just sitting on a bench on the far edge of the park. She looked a bit out of place, but she seemed harmless, as she would smile and say hello. From the first time Paws saw her, sitting on that bench, he lowered his head and growled deeply. I figured it was nothing. The last time he had growled had been the old man, but this just must be a coincidence, right? Well, I was wrong. The next day in the park, the woman was nowhere to be seen, and Paws ran over to the bench where she would sit and began to dig. I tried to stop him, but before I could, I saw a bone. It looked human. He kept on digging, and the police were called. A few days later, again on the news, It turns out that that beautiful woman had murdered her husband and 2 children last summer, burying them in plain sight, right in the park. Well, many years have passed and Paws is older now. 13, actually. He doesn't walk as well as he used to. He can barely see anymore, and his eyes are cloudy, as if a mist is covering them more and more. I can barely stand the thought of losing my best friend. Well, I met Colleen about 5 months ago, and she is everything I could ever want. Smart, beautiful, kind, loyal. She's wonderful. She even volunteers at a home for sick children who are dying. She stays with them as they go through their last moments. It's amazing the type of woman that she is. I'm so lucky. Well, I had just proposed the week earlier and couldn't wait to introduce her to my parents. And, of course, Paws. We flew across the country, holding hands the whole time on the plane flight like we were teenagers. When we got there, we got in a cab and headed over to my parents' home. Opening the door, my mother smiled and instantly gave Colleen a hug. My father walked over behind her, smiling as well, and told her welcome to the family. John has said such wonderful things about you. I asked about Paws, and they said nothing. Knowing how much I loved my dog, they were dreading telling me the news. They had taken him to the doctor, and he would have to be put to sleep in the morning. The doctor had nodded when they explained how much I loved Paws, and that they wanted him to pass away at his home. He was in the other room, laying on a blanket and sleeping. He couldn't walk anymore, and hadn't opened his eyes for a couple days. Colleen gave me a hug, as she knew how much he meant to me. Fighting back tears, I nodded to my parents and walked with Colleen into the guest bedroom, where my best friend was laying down. I put my hand on his back and put my forehead against his. His eyes were closed, but as I continued to talk to him, he slowly opened his eyes. Barely able to move, his tail started to wag slowly, and he dug his head into my chest. And we both just sat there, together. My protector. It was then I heard footsteps behind me, and remembered that Colleen was here too. I had forgotten all about her. Paws turned his head and looked at Colleen through his cloudy eyes. The conversation was normal until one of the speakers suffered a sudden and violent death. It began when a young, fresh-faced youth with an old-fashioned camera draped around his neck approached a young woman sitting on a park bench. "Excuse me, miss?" he began tentatively. She looked up from her phone and brushed a lock of blonde hair out of her green eyes. "Yes?" she said, masking her mild annoyance with a smile. "I'm doing a photography project for my school," he said, "and I was wondering if I could photograph you." "Oh," she said. The request seemed to puzzle yet flatter her. She thought for a moment and then said, "Sure." "Great," said the young man, smiling. "Over there by that tree would be best." The woman gladly obliged, and the two strode over to the tree together, where the woman posed somewhat awkwardly with a smile that was almost genuine. "Actually," the young man said, "would you mind moving over a couple feet to the left? Just here? The woman asked, shuffling over a couple feet. Just a bit more, he said. She moved over a few more inches and smiled. Two things happened at once. The camera flashed, and the young woman's head exploded into a bloody pulp. Suddenly, the world's volume was turned down. My heart pounded in my ears. The woman's body went limp and sank to the grass, spilling blood from her neck in a torrential fountain. The bystanders screamed, and my hands fumbled for my phone to dial 911. My hands were shaking badly, and I almost dropped the phone into the grass. After I dialed, I held the ringing phone to my ear and looked up. The young man was nowhere to be seen. I wondered where he had gone, but the thought was driven from my head as a 911 operator picked up. 911, said the woman's voice. What is your emergency? But I couldn't answer. Something was severely wrong with me. There didn't seem to be enough air in my lungs, and my hands started to feel cold and numb. I was dizzy now. The world spun, and the ground rose up to meet my face, smashing my nose painfully. My vision began to swim in darkness, and then there was nothing. When the EMTs revived me, the woman's body had already been packed into the ambulance and taken away, though the blood stain remained, a dark stain of brown against the green of the grass. The EMTs said I'd had a panic attack and passed out. The police took my statement and they sent me home, numb with shock. A few weeks later, I found out that the woman had been hit by a stray bullet from someone shooting cans in their backyard a mile away. It was a 1 in a million shot, they said. A week later, I saw the young man again. He wore the exact same clothes, had the exact same haircut and cheerful grin, and the same old-fashioned camera was draped around his neck. I saw him by chance through the window of a restaurant, chatting up an elderly couple who sat in a corner booth. The silent, smiling conversation did not last long before the young man convinced them to get up and move to another booth. He lifted his camera to his face, and nothing happened. The old woman smiled and cocked her head to the side as if she was asking him something. He smiled back and raised a finger before lifting the camera to his face again. There was a sound like roaring thunder, and the wall of the restaurant exploded into dust and debris. A truck had crashed through the wall and demolished the old couple's booth. The young man stood there as if nothing had happened. He raised the camera to his face, took one more picture, and then turned to leave. He pushed the door to the restaurant open and walked out. He stopped and scanned the street. His gaze halted on me. The screaming and the chaos faded into silence as his preternaturally blue eyes bore into mine, turning my insides to ice. And then, in a moment, he was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I hoped after that to never see him again, but fate did not care much about my hopes. It never does. I was having dinner with my wife and 5-year-old daughter, Sarah, and the air was filled with laughter and the smell of my wife's baked pork chops and creamed mushrooms. Sarah was telling us a story about a strange man she'd met by the school who had offered to take her picture. She said he had a strange smile and a really old camera like she had never seen before. My heart sat up and began to beat against the inside of my chest. Trying to maintain the illusion of calm, I set my fork down gently on my plate, and I told her that if she ever saw that man again, she was to run, and that she absolutely, under no circumstances, was she allowed to let him take her picture. "But he did take my picture, Dad," said Sarah. "He wouldn't let me see it, but he said he'd come show me when it was ready in a week." "What?" I gasped. My voice was hoarse and small. My wife was looking between my Sarah and I with a look of concerned confusion. Sarah seemed to sense that something was wrong, and her chin began to quiver. "Nothing's wrong, honey," I said. "Everything is going to be okay." The lie struggled out of my throat, and the guilt of it seized my heart and squeezed it tight. Sarah's eyes were watery, but she continued what she was saying. "He said something else too, Dad," she said uncertainly. "He said it was very important." "Yes?" "He said he wouldn't develop my picture if you let him take yours. In the park tomorrow at noon." A wave of relief intermingled with sadness washed over me, and a tension I hadn't even noticed dissolved from my shoulders. I could feel the tears starting out in my eyes as I kissed my daughter's head, taking in a huge whiff of her scent, that scent of pure youth that makes the old feel young again. I kissed my wife hard on the lips, savoring the taste, half lipstick and half the pork chops she'd just eaten. "I love you, Janine," I said. "And I love you too, Sarah." They looked at me uncomprehendingly, concerned as if I had lost my mind. I've always loved my family more than life itself, and tomorrow at noon, I guess I will have to prove it. Perhaps I can get the better of the stranger, perhaps not. Wish me luck. Nobody knows what rock bottom truly is until they've hit it. Being abruptly fired from a job you've worked at for the past 10 years, and then catching your girl cheating on you with your replacement really makes a man think. Hell, my student loans aren't even paid off yet. What a shit show this life is. After a rather boozy night that consisted of sending out about 4 dozen resumes and horrendously written cover letters, I passed out. When I woke up the next morning, I decided to at least try and make some money at home while waiting for an interview. At that moment, I thought that the best way to go about it was completing those internet surveys that yielded $5 Subway gift cards and other shit like that after about an hour of answering questions. I mean, I didn't have any other marketable skills that could have yielded immediate income. It was either that or wasting the day away playing computer games. At least I wouldn't have to pay for food. I did these surveys for about 5 hours before nearly passing out. It was way more excruciating than I'd originally anticipated. At the end of those 5 hours, I'd accumulated about $45 in cash and gift cards. $9 an hour. Not like I was making much more than that before. I was about to close my laptop up for the day and head to a bar in an attempt to drown out my melancholy when I first saw it. It shouldn't even have been noticeable, but for one reason or another, it was. At the bottom corner of the website that I was on existed a tiny, singular advertisement. Maybe it was the simplicity that got me. Plain black letters in a tacky font that read "Surveys for Cash" overlapped a completely white background. At least they were direct with the message. One more couldn't hurt, I thought. Might as well scrape together a little bit more booze money before heading out. I sat back down, clicked on the picture link, and prepared myself to grind through some more painstaking inquiries. The first few questions were simple enough. I guess they weren't really questions, but more data collection. My name, age, and occupation. I thought it was kind of weird that they also asked my height and weight, but it wasn't unheard of. The first real question was a different story, though. I must have stared at it, eyes wide and mouth agape, for God knows how long. What the actual hell? In plain English, this is what popped up on my screen. How strong is your urge to currently look behind you? There were 5 options below, ranging from not at all to overwhelming. There was no feasible reason why I should have been afraid at that moment, but I was. I tightened my breathing, trying to make out any subtle noises behind me. There were none. After maybe about 5 minutes, I worked up the courage to look. There was nothing. I sighed in relief and scoffed at myself at the same time. This must have been some kind of joke. However, I decided to entertain it, answering neutral and clicking on to the next question. This is what it read. Why would you look behind you? I smirked. Funny. before simply typing in a "I don't know" in the response box and once again clicking next. This was the third question. You're on a plane. Apart from you, there is only one passenger who is sitting somewhere behind you. At some point, you get up to go to the washroom and find that the man is gone. You check to see if he is in the only bathroom on the plane, but he isn't. What do you do? Again, I must have stupidly stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. Was this some kind of obscure personality test? I mean, it must have been, right? Right? I put the same answer that I used for the last question. I don't know. It was true. I didn't know. How was I supposed to answer this shit? I click next again, now more intrigued than anything. The fourth question went like this. You wake up in woods unfamiliar to you. It's nighttime, and the moonlight provides you with only slight visibility. About 30 feet away from you, there is a small, dimly illuminated cabin. The door is open, and a smiling woman is motioning for you to come in. Do you go? Explain why. The question wasn't necessarily weirder than the last one, so my conjecture that this was some kind of odd personality test was still feasible. I actually made an attempt to answer this one, something along the lines of going into the cabin because there's simply nowhere else to go. Once again, I click next. Probably shouldn't have. The questions started getting really messed up. They weren't too gory or explicit, not anything like that. They were just stranger, weirder, more psychologically disturbing. If you're wondering why the hell I kept going, I can't really give you an explicit answer to that. I just felt like I had to. It was an esoteric, creeping sensation that I can't quite explain away. But I could never shake it, so I just went on. Some of the questions that stood out were, suppose that you wake up one night to find an elevator in your house. During every midnight after that, it opens up for 5 minutes, revealing an exact copy of yourself that gets progressively more injured as time goes on. Do you keep living like this? Or do you enter the elevator once and end it all? And you're in a hotel room but are awoken by a rapid knocking at your window. You peek through the blinds, seeing what appears to be a man missing both his eyes. He puts his mouth to the glass and tells you to kill the woman in the bathroom immediately. Do you listen to him? This was one of my least favorites. You are watching home videos with your mother. One of the tapes include footage of her being murdered by a masked intruder. Your mother simply laughs at this footage without saying anything. In your opinion, is this a cause for concern? In addition to this insanity-inducing shit, there were some rather disconcerting events happening in real life as well. I received a knock at the door about 30 minutes in. I look through my peephole to find a guy standing there, frantically shaking his head and mouthing "no" while making direct eye contact with me. He looked terrified. Obviously, I didn't open up. I received about 10 phone calls from somebody named the Auditor on my caller ID. They left a message every time, but each one was just a recording that consisted of somebody saying numbers through heavy static. Actually, it sounded more like screaming now that I think about it. About an hour into this thing, I was on the verge of a mental breakdown. I was petrified of looking behind me, even though there was no indication that anything should have been there. I heard some soft scratching coming from my vent at one point. So I moved my couch under it. Eventually, I reached what appeared to be the end of the survey. However, it wasn't a question. It was simply a statement. Don't let them in. They're not to be trusted. Almost as if it were on cue, I heard more knocking at my door about 5 seconds after reading this. As slowly and silently as I could, I moved over and looked through the peephole once again. It was a different person than the one I'd seen earlier. She was a woman looking to be in her mid-20s. She was wearing a thick blazer despite it being around 90 Fahrenheit outside. She was also wearing sunglasses, so I could never tell where she was actually looking. She eventually took a piece of paper out of her pocket and slipped it under the door. I read the note. It's lying. Leave your apartment immediately. It's been about half an hour since. I can't bring myself to look at the computer screen nor at the woman outside. She's still there. I can see the shadows of her feet from underneath my door. I heard my bedroom window open a few minutes ago, but I've since jammed the door shut with a chair. I can hear some kind of distorted muttering coming from behind it now. Maybe rock bottom wasn't so bad. But what the hell am I supposed to do here? I was lying alone in my room when I heard the voice, deep and crackly, coming from beneath my bed. "Hey!" the voice called out. I told myself I was just imagining it. "Hey, kid!" the voice repeated. I drew my knees to my chest and ducked my head under the blanket, trying to shut out the voice and the cold wind that drifted in through the window, ruffling the curtains. "Who are you?" I asked. "I'm the monster underneath your bed," the voice replied. "You mean you're real?" I asked. "What do you mean?" the monster said. "Of course I'm real." "Do you have a name?" I asked. "Of course I have a name." "Oh, well, what is it?" "Frank." "Frank?" "Yeah," the monster said. "There's something wrong with that?" "No, I mean, I don't know," I said. "It's just not very monsterly." "Well, my parents didn't want me to be a monster." "Really? What did they want you to be?" "A dentist." "That's funny," I said. I could feel myself beginning to smile. "What do your parents want you to be?" it asked. I don't know. Hey, Frank? "Yeah?" "Aren't you gonna, scare me or something?" "What? Why would I do that?" "Well, you're a monster, aren't you?" "Well, yeah, of course I am. But that doesn't mean I scare little kids." "But I thought that was your job." "It is my job to scare people," he replied. "But only bad people." "Am I a bad person?" I asked. "Nah," he said. "But you're not the one I'm here to scare." "Who are you here to scare?" I asked. "The man inside your closet." The skin on my arms goose-fleshed up. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I fell silent as I heard a rustling coming from the closet. The door creaked open and I could hear soft footsteps padding towards me across the bedroom floor. I didn't dare peek out of my blanket. The footsteps stopped and I could hear heavy breathing next to me. I squeezed my eyes tight. The warm sanctuary of the blanket disappeared as it was yanked off me. I hugged my arms around my knees and prepared for the worst. A scream shattered the night air, followed by the sound of breaking glass. I opened my eyes a crack to see a knife lying on the carpet next to my bed, blade glinting in the moonlight. My parents rushed into the room and asked me what had happened, but I didn't know what to say. Only that someone had been hiding in my closet and they jumped out the window. My parents called 911 and the police came right away. They picked up a man called Gary Thompson sprinting through the streets a couple blocks away. He was covered in blood and broken glass. They found Gary's car abandoned on our property, and inside they found duct tape, knives, barbiturates, and a video camera. From what I heard, Gary's lawyer employed an insanity defense, and Gary is currently incarcerated in a state mental facility for the criminally insane. I never heard from Frank the Monster again, but the officer who arrested Gary told me that he sleeps on the floor of the facility. He tells the doctors that he's terrified of Frank, the monster under his bed.